Number 5 on this list is El Chupacabra. You guys should know who El Chupacabra is by this point, considering we've talked about this creature tons on this channel before. Basically, it is a legendary creature in the Central Americas that's said to drink the blood of livestock. Although this creature seems like it's probably fake, it might be real, just not exactly how we might expect it to be. Carolyn Beccia says, "We are taught from an early age, don't approach scary looking dogs." And while no one can get a clear picture of Bigfoot, the Kraken, or the Loch Ness Monster, there is one monster that is oddly not camera shy: the legendary El Chupacabra. The Chupacabra was first sighted in Puerto Rico in the 70s. A wave of sightings followed in the late 1990s. During this time, livestock throughout Puerto Rico was found drained of blood. These Chupacabra, or goat sucker, attacks caused panic with local residents who claimed a vampire was feeding on their livestock. Although descriptions have varied, most describe a hairless, alien-like monster with spikes going down its back and glowing red eyes. It sounds dubious, but how could so many people be taking pictures of the same ugly dog-like creature? The answer may be one found in science. One plausible theory is that these creatures are coyotes suffering from sarcoptic mange, an inflammatory skin condition caused by the itch-inducing parasite mite scabies. Wolves, dogs, and coyotes infected with scabies will have extreme hair loss, skin shriveling, and constricted blood vessels that can lead to life-threatening fatigue. And while usually a coyote or wolf will have no problems hunting prey, once infected by sarcoptic mange, coyotes may choose to hunt more available meals such as livestock. So it's actually possible that this creature is real, it's just not what we thought at all. I know that this takes away from some of the mystery and lore around it, but ultimately this would make a lot of sense. When you think about it, what's more likely? A space alien comes crashing to Earth and starts sucking the blood of our livestock, or some coyotes get a disease and start doing it instead? I tend to side with the coyotes. Either way though, that doesn't make these coyotes nice or friendly or approachable. Still treat them like you would a chupacabra, with caution. Number 4 on this list is the Stemphalian Birds. We gotta go all the way back to ancient Greece for this one. Caroline Beccia says, one of Hercules' labors was to kill the Stemphalian birds, man-eating birds who had the peculiar habit of throwing dung. The Greeks were not the only ones who liked to scare their youngsters with killer bird tales. The Maori tribe of New Zealand told similar legends of the Pokie or Haikoi, a giant black and white bird that swooped down from the sky to pick off small children. Scientists today know that these thunderbirds existed. Called Haast's eagle, the bird stood over 6 feet tall and had a wingspan of over 8 feet. The Haast eagle would sit atop trees and then ambush its prey by swooping down at 60-mile-per-hour speeds. Then it would disembowel its meal with sharp talons before the poor slob could even worry about dung throwing. Hercules would never have survived to these hellbirds, but you can sleep well tonight. The Haast's eagle went extinct around the 15th century. Anything that could annihilate Hercules would definitely be a no-go for me, guys. That dude was literally a demigod, and if these guys could have beaten him, then we wouldn't have stood a chance. Lucky for us, they are extinct now, but for the people back then, they would have had their hands full with these creatures. If, of course, they still had hands and the beast hadn't ripped them off yet. Number 3 on this list is the Kraken. We have one of the most famous folklore creatures here, guys, that, as we know now, turned out to be real. The Kraken was especially big in Norse culture. All of those people up there in the Nordic regions feared this wicked beast, as it was said to be able to pull down entire ships with hundreds of men on board. Instances where exactly that happened did actually transpire. Ships with tons of people on them that were literally made for battle would be out on the water, and then boom, Kraken attack and they're toasted. Except it wasn't really the Kraken now, was it? The Kraken looks very similar to an actual animal that we have in our world that is also super deadly and really strong. The giant squid. Giant squids, in case you couldn't tell from the name, are giant. They're pretty big. They are so big actually, they would have had the capability to take down an old ship like this. In fact, we've even seen these beasts do some serious damage to submarines, and they're made of metal. They easily could have sunk a wooden boat from hundreds or thousands of years ago. And if you were a sailor on said wooden boat and you saw this massive creature with several tentacles sucking you to the bottom of the ocean, then you would probably exaggerate what happened as well too. It's very easy to see how the legend of the Kraken got started and started to snowball as more encounters with the giant squid happened. I'm glad that the Kraken isn't technically real, because the giant squid is already bad enough. Number 2 on this list is the Charybdis. What was initially thought to be a folkloric creature may have been real, but not exactly in the way that we might think. Caroline Beccia says, "Nothing is more frightening than being sucked underwater by a whirlpool that feeds on human flesh 3 times a day." The Charybdis first appeared in Homer's Odyssey. During this epic tale, Odysseus must sail between the 6-headed sea monster Scylla and the flesh-eating whirlpool Charybdis. These 2 dueling sea monsters attacked in intervals, much like a whirlpool's regular intervals of tidal activity. It sounds terrifying, but whirlpools that pull ships underwater really do happen. Known today as Garofalo, one is found in the strait between Italy's mainland and Sicily. Garofalo occurs when winds blow across the strait in opposition to the tides. This makes it technically not a whirlpool because there's no circular motion, but it does have the ability to wreak havoc on ships and pull humans into a watery grave. So this deadly creature was real, it just ended up not being a creature at all. Back in the times when these stories were written, there would have been many folklore legends about evil sea monsters that could pull brave sailors into the sea. The reality of the situation is though that the ships we had back then kinda sucked, and it was a lot easier for the weather and other conditions to sink the ships. That's why there were so many legends of monsters coming from the ocean for so long. Finally, number 1 on this list is the Incubus Demon. This demon is an evil demon who is thought to sneak into your home and have sexual relations with you as you're sleeping. This creature is real in a sense. It just so happens that it's actually in our minds. During the witch hunt craze of the 16th and 17th century, people had some really messed up ideas on how human reproduction occurred. One way was for a demon to steal a man's seed and impregnate a helpless woman during her sleep. The monster that stole the precious sperm was called a succubus, and the monster that implanted the sperm was called an incubus. The incubus would sit on top of your chest while you slept, making it impossible for you to move if you woke. Sort of like being assaulted by a possessed sexomniac. But before you condemn medieval people as crazed horn dogs trying to attack innocent women, there is a scientific basis for believing in such monsters. The condition is called sleep paralysis. During sleep paralysis, you are fully awake but cannot move or cry for help. It feels like you've had a stroke, but although it's terrifying, sleep paralysis is harmless. Most sleep experts attribute it to being caught between REM, rapid eye movement, and NREM, non-rapid eye movement sleep. Either way, before sleep stages were understood, we can see how our ancestors would have thought it was a demon sitting on your chest. So literally, this demon creature that apparently attacked people was never real at all. It just felt extremely real from our minds. I've experienced sleep paralysis before, and although I didn't experience any demon thing, I can 100% see how people would have believed this back then. It could definitely have felt like that and would have got people on the lookout for this sick and twisted demon of the night.
Coming in at 5, Black Annis. Black Annis, also known as Black Agnes or Black Anna, is a boogeyman figure in English folklore. She is imagined as a blue-faced hag or witch with iron claws and a taste for human flesh, especially children. It is said that she haunts the countryside of Leicestershire, living in a cave in the Dane Hills with a great oak tree at the entrance. At night she is known to venture out looking for unsuspecting children and lambs to eat, then tanning their skin by hanging them on a tree before wearing them around her waist. Legend goes that she used her iron claws to dig her cave out of the side of a sandstone cliff, making herself a home there, which is now referred to as Black Annis Bower Close. This legend actually led to parents warning their children the Black Anis would come and get them if they did not behave. She was also known to hide in the branches of her oak tree waiting to leap upon unsuspecting prey. Now in other traditions it is said that Black Anis would grind her teeth, which folks would hear, giving them time to bolt their doors and keep away from the window, otherwise she would reach in and snatch them. It is also said that cottages in Leicestershire were built with small windows to deter Black Anis. She could only reach one arm inside. Coming in at 4, Changeling. A changeling is a human-like creature found in folklore throughout Europe, particularly British folklore. It was believed that a changeling was a fairy child that had been left in place of a human child stolen by the fairies. A changeling is typically identifiable via a number of traits. A fairy child may appear sickly and won't grow in size like a normal child, and may have notable physical characteristics such as a beard or long teeth. Now, to quote D.L. Ashelman, a human child might be taken due to many factors: to act as a servant, the love of a human child, or malice. Most often it was thought that fairies exchanged the children. In rare cases, the very elderly of the fairy people would be exchanged in the place of a human baby, so that the old fairy could live in comfort being coddled by its human parents. Simple charms such as an inverted coat or open iron scissors left where the child sleeps were thought to ward them off. Other measures included a constant watch over the child. Now in the Anglo-Scottish border region it was believed that elves or fairies lived in elf hills or fairy hills. Along with this belief in supernatural beings was the view that they could spirit away children and even adults and take them back to their own world. Often it was thought a baby would be snatched and replaced with a simulation of the baby, usually a male adult fairy to be suckled by the mother. The real baby would be treated well by the elves and would grow up to be one of them, whereas the changeling baby would be discontented and worrisome. Coming in at 3, Black Shook. Also known as Old Shook, Old Shock, or simply Shook, this is the name given to an East Anglian ghostly black dog which is said to roam the coastline and countryside of East Anglia, one of the many ghostly black dogs recorded in folklore across the British Isles. Accounts of Black Shook form part of the folklore of Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire Fens and Essex. Now the description of Black Shook varies in both shape and size, from that of a large dog to being the size of a calf or a horse. To quote W.A. Dutt in his 1901 Highways and Byways in East Anglia, he takes the form of a huge black dog and prowls along dark lanes and lonesome field footpaths where, although his howling makes the hearer's blood run cold, his footfalls make no sound. You may know him at once, should you see him, by his fiery eyes. He has but one, and that, like the Cyclops, is in the middle of his head. But such an encounter might bring you the worst of luck. It is even said that to meet him is to be warned that your death will occur before the end of the year. So you will do well to shut your eyes if you hear him howling. Shut them even if you are uncertain whether it is the dog fiend or the voice of the wind you hear. Should you never set eyes on our Norfolk Snarlio, you may perhaps doubt his existence and, like other learned folks, tell us that his story is nothing but the old Scandinavian myth of the Black Hound of Odin, brought to us by the Vikings who long ago settled down on the Norfolk coast. Coming in at 2, Jenny Greenteeth. Jenny Greenteeth, also known as the Wicked Jenny, is a river hag similar to Peg Powler or Grindy Low. She would pull children or the elderly into the water and drown them. The name is also used to describe pondweed or duckweed, which can form a continuous mat over the surface of a small body of water, making it misleading and potentially treacherous, especially to unwary children. Now, Jenny Greenteeth was often described as green-skinned with long hair and sharp teeth. She is called Ginny Greenteeth in Lancashire and North Staffordshire, but in Cheshire and Shropshire she is called Wicked Jenny, Ginny Greenteeth or Jeannie Greenteeth. She is sometimes described as lurking in the upper branches of trees at night, although this may be a folklorist confusion. She became so infamous around Britain that she inspired a slew of characters in pop culture. Jenny inspired the lake monster Meg Mucklebones in the 1985 Ridley Scott fantasy film Legend. She is also the title character in a book of short stories, Jenny Greenteeth and Other Short Stories. She is also the main subject of a poem Welsh Maiden by Joel Hayway. She also appears in a number of Dungeons & Dragons adventure modules, including DDEX01 Tales Treat Hell, DDAL0401 Suits of the Mist, DDAL0406 The Ghost, and DDAL0414 The Dark Lord. And finally coming in at number 1, Beast of Bodmin Moor. In British folklore, the Beast of Bodmin Moor, also known as the Beast of Bodmin, is a phantom wildcat purported to live in Cornwall, England, United Kingdom. The location became a centre for sightings after 1978, with occasional reports of mutilated slain livestock. The alleged panther-like cats of the same region came to be popularly known as the Beast of Bodmin Moor. One hypothesis suggests the possibility that alien big cats were at large in the United Kingdom and could have been imported as part of private collections of zoos, later escaped or were even set free. An escaped cat would not have been reported to the authorities due to the illegality of owning and importing the animals. During one occasion, a boy was walking by the River Fowey when he discovered a large cat skull measuring about 4 inches long by 7 inches wide. The skull was lacking its lower jaw but possessed 2 sharp prominent canines that suggested it might have been a leopard. The story, of course, hit the national press before it was sent to the Natural History Museum in London. Now, in general, scientists reject such claims because of the improbably large numbers necessary to maintain a breeding population, and because climate and food supply issues would make such purported creatures' survival in reported habitats very unlikely.
Kicking off at number 5, the Questing Beast. And what better place to begin our folkloric journey than with the ultimate adversary of all things monster hunting in the long history of the British Isles, the Questing Beast. And yeah, whilst the name may be a dead giveaway, in folklore there is perhaps no other creature that is quite as bizarre as this one. Otherwise known as the Beaglatistion or the Barking Beast, this particular creature is a key monster in Arthurian legend, and in the forgotten days of King Arthur's Britain, his Knights of the Round Table, most prominently Sir Palomides and Sir Percival, made it their quest to hunt this thing down. As the legend goes, this strange creature had the head and neck of a snake, the body of a leopard, the haunches of a lion, and the cloven feet of a hart. The name, primarily Beaglatistion, comes from the great noise that it emits from its belly, a barking noise that allegedly sounded like 30 couple hounds questing. Bizarrely enough though, the legend of the Questing Beast is allegedly a variant of the mythological medieval view on giraffes. Do with that information as you will, but yeah, that's anyone's guess. Perhaps the most memorable appearance of the Questing Beast in Arthurian legend was in Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, where after he had an affair with his half-sister Morgan, they didn't know they were related at the time, just FYI, the Questing Beast appears to Arthur in a disturbing vision drinking from a clear and still pool. In that same dream, he sees a prophecy that foretells Mordred's destruction of Camelot, and he then intertwines the two. Later on, Merlin reveals to Arthur that the Questing Beast was actually born of a human woman, a princess who lusted after her own brother. Sound familiar? Well, in the legend told by Merlin, eventually the brother was sentenced to death by their own father and was torn to shreds by rabid dogs, the same sound that the Questing Beast made. Essentially, Arthur saw his own near downfall in a dream, and the Questing Beast was the result of that. Yeah, exactly. Star Wars ain't got nothing on this. Swinging in at number 4, the Derek Doit. As William Congreve wrote in his 1697 play The Morning Bride, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned. The Derek Doit is perhaps Ireland's most tragic and fearsome tale of that fact, one that is still whispered at grave sites and burials to this day. Surprisingly enough, in terms of horror, the Derek Doit is perhaps a lot more recognisable than we may have first imagined. In fact, loosely meaning red blood sucker, this terrifying visage of folklore horror is the closest that Celtic mythology has come to detailing the archetypal vampire. As the legend goes, thousands of years ago, she was a legendary beauty with blood-red lips and pale blonde hair, and her true name has since been lost to the ages, overshadowed by the folklore villain she became. As kind as she was beautiful, the Derek Doit was the envy of every clan in Ireland, and suitors lined up to win her hand in marriage. As fate would have it though, this sweet-natured girl fell in love with a local peasant, an equally handsome man who was kind and well-natured too, but alas, he was penniless. Eventually, the girl's father instead agreed for an old and violently cruel man to marry her, securing a fortune in the process. He kept her locked in a tower and had an affinity for making her bleed. Day after day, he tortured her, locked away in a tower cell, while she waited in vain for the kind peasant boy to somehow come and rescue her. That hope alone kept her alive for many months, but one day, when all hope was gone, she took her own life. As the legend tells it, the Derek Doit is buried in a small churchyard near Strongbow's Tree in the southeast of Ireland. But that wasn't the end of her. In death, she rose from the earth that same night she was buried, driven mad by the half-remembered visions of her own blood welling on her own skin, thirsty for revenge. As they tell it, every night the Derek Doit rises as the red blood drinker, hunting down young men in a blind and natural revenge. She calls to them in a strange, haunting siren song that lingers in their mind as they sleep, where they eventually follow her to a grave and she feasts on them. The Derek Doit is as tragic as it is violent, and it's a cautionary tale that leaves little to be desired. Next up at number 3, the Queer Hornk. And on the same theme as the Derek Doit, there is perhaps no other female figure of folklore that is more terrifying than the legendary Queer Hornk. And this one, instead of drawing upon the tragic image of the forsaken daughter turned ravenous blood-drinking vampire, this one instead takes the visage of the mother. And not just any archetypal mother. No, oh no, but instead the mother of the devil himself, the fire spitter, the mother of all demons, and one of the greatest adversaries in the whole of Irish mythology. As the legend goes, when the planet was nothing but a swirling mass of vapour, water and rock, Queer Hornk was hatched deep in the molten core of the planet. There for eons upon eons she waited, patiently biding her time before we humans stepped into existence. You see, the fire spitter needed food for her children to feast upon, and guess what? We were that food. And in the early days of humanity, the mother of demons and her children feasted upon us in a frenzy. However, there is one turning point of this legend where something remarkable happened, and believe it or not, but the legend of Queer Hornk is actually inexplicably tied to the patron saint of Ireland himself, Patrick. Well, he went by Patricius back then, but still. Strangely enough, when the legend of St. Patrick is attributed to his removal of all of the snakes from Ireland in some folkloric canons, those very same snakes are instead the fire spitter and her children. As the legend goes, Patrick had traced Queer Hornk's home back to the cave on Station Island, which also allegedly served as a portal to hell. There they battled for 2 days and 2 nights before the fire spitter retreated through the swamps and poisoned all of the wells on her way. Eventually the pair fought in a great lake where the mother of demons swallowed St. Patrick whole as they both sank into the cold, shadowy darkness of Loch Derg. Thankfully for him though, St. Patrick tore his way out of her belly and she was banished to the dark, miserable depths for eternity. Thank you very much, St. Patrick. Coming in at number 2, the Changeling. Because we can't really talk about Celtic folklore without describing some of the most prolific entities in the mythos of both Celtic and European culture. The Fae, fairies. In Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann and the Ail She, the people of the mounds, and a race of mythical and mystical entities that have since established themselves in playing some of the most important roles in Celtic folklore. In Irish and Scottish mythology specifically, the Tuatha De Danann were considered to be the people of the goddess Danu, the mother goddess, and later they eventually evolved into a far more supernatural design. It is said that the fairies of Celtic folklore could bestow great blessings and equally dangerous curses, and perhaps one of the most terrifying examples of that is with the Changeling, a fairy child left behind in place of a stolen human child. Now, although the theme itself has been used to explain away many unexplained afflictions, diseases and disorders of the time, the cultural significance of the Changeling, particularly in horror literature and cinema, has been pretty staggering. You see, it plays on one key parental fear of a child becoming uncanny, a split double of their former self. A changeling is typically identified by a number of unusual traits. In Irish legend, a fairy child may appear sickly or will cease to grow in size like a normal child would. In many folklore legends, these changelings grow notable physical characteristics. They may grow a beard or grow long in the tooth, literally. Quickly they may display an intelligence that is far beyond their years, as well as develop the power of foresight. They will know things that should be outside of their knowledge, harnessed by the power of the Ail She. In some very rare cases, it was the very elderly of a fairy that was replaced as a changeling, so that the old fairy could instead live in comfort, being coddled by its human parents without them ever knowing. In folk legend, protecting oneself from a changeling was of the utmost importance, and simple charms such as an inverted coat or open iron scissors left where the child slept were required to ward them off. Beware the changeling, that's all I can say. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Balor. And truth be told, we can't really have any other creation of folklore as our number 1 spot Balor, the big bad baddie of Celtic mythology, is a figure that features most proficiently in the mythos of Irish and Scottish folklore, whereas on the one hand we have the mythical Tuatha De Danann, on the other we have the Fomorians, a supernatural race of monstrosities who shamble their way from the bowels of the earth to wreak havoc on we humans and engage in an eternal battle with the Fae. In Celtic mythology, this guy is the tyrant leader of them all. He is often described as a giant with one single large eye that wreaks destruction wherever it casts its gaze. Where have we heard that one before? Perhaps derived from the common Celtic word Balaros, meaning the deadly one, Balor is the be-all and end-all of destruction and devastation in the ancient history of the British Isles. Believed to be the personification of blight and drought, it was written in prophecy that Balor would eventually be slain by his own grandson, Lug, who would become the storm god of Celtic mythology and bring an end to the suffering that Balor wrought. From his fortress on Tory Island, in many myths and legends, Balor is described as a giant eye at the top of a tower that when opened carves a path of destruction in its wake. As many legends tell it, once opened it could destroy entire armies with a single glance. Although in many other instances Balor is a humanoid figure that walks beside men, as some folklorists described, he had a single eye in his forehead, a venomous fiery eye. There were always 7 coverings over this eye, and one by one Balor removed them. With the first the bracken began to wither, with the second the grass became copper coloured, with the third the woods and the timber began to heat, with the fourth smoke came from the trees, with the fifth everything grew red, with the sixth it sparked, and with the seventh they were all set on fire and the whole countryside was ablaze. You see, whichever way you spin it, Balor was the personification of pretty much all evil in Celtic mythology and folklore, and when it comes to big bad baddies, yeah, they don't get much nastier than this guy. Kicking off at number 5, the Ganga. And our first entry heads us off to Norway, Sweden and Denmark, as this particular undead revenant has been morphed and shaped into a few different depictions throughout the history of Scandinavia. Now, although the Draugr of Scandinavian legend is perhaps their most prolific of folklore abominations, and this particular entry functions in a similar way, the Ganga likes to do things a little differently. Derived from the prefix gen, which roughly translates to forward or towards, and then Ganga, which is derived from a word meaning foot or walk. The Ganga roughly translates to walking after death. And I needn't say no more to give you guys an idea about where this one's going, right? As the legend goes, the Ganga were the corpses of the dead that had reason to return to the mortal plane. Usually people that had been murdered or people that had committed suicide would return to their town and village after clawing their way from their own graves. Throughout the Viking age, the Ganga were seen throughout several sagas such as the Grettis and the saga of Eric the Red. Here, much like the Draugr, they were often slayed and easily defeated by their heroes, but in a more contemporary setting, as Scandinavia became Christianized, the Ganga became a sort of undead, violent zombie vampire that would break into the homes of their unsuspecting victims to spread disease. Whilst they were sleeping, they would attack people with their Dodin Keniep, which translates to the dead man's pinch, and when they awoke, their victim's skin would be sunken and blue, infected by the plague of the Ganga. That's not very nice. Swinging in at number 4, the Liko. And for this one we're heading over to the most intriguing, captivating and equally terrifying kingdom of Slavic mythology and folklore, which other than Celtic comes in as one of my personal favourite European folktales. Because we've all got a list of that, right? Now, Slavic lore is mainly focused on the balance of good and bad luck, and the Liko is perhaps the personification of the latter as the cultural embodiment of all evil and misfortune. Otherwise known as the Licho or Liho in several other Eastern European countries, the Liko is often described as an elderly woman dressed entirely in black, with one distinctive, terrifying eye peering out of her darkened veil. In other versions, the Liko also appear as a male goblin-like creature that is often found perching on tree branches or farmers' fences, peering silently at its victim. That's a pretty creepy image, right? In ancient times, the Liko was often thought to be a servant of death itself, and any quiet appearance that it made would mark the end of their days for whoever first glimpsed it, and in many cases, even entire villages. During pre-Christian times, Slavic villages would conduct a ritual to ward off the Liko during times of plague and famine, where they'd carve a feminine-like idol with one eye and then burn it on a pyre in an effort to combat the malevolence of the native Liko. In one particular tale, a local local blacksmith was beset upon by Liko, but just as she was about to eat him, he bargained with her that he was a legendary crafter and could forge for her anything that she liked. She chose an eye so she could finally have two to see with, and the blacksmith agreed. He told her that he'd have to bind her down whilst he hammered in the new eye so that she didn't make any sudden movements, and when the Liko was securely tied to the chair, the blacksmith shoved the red hot poker through the Liko's one good eye. That's one way to do it, right? Next up at number 3, Philiath. And whilst this particular entry may perhaps be a little familiar to you, it nonetheless still holds its own as one of the most intriguing cases of ancient folklore colliding with the modern era. In Scottish folklore, the Philiath, otherwise known in Scots as Amphiliath Moor, or otherwise known as the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui, this creature is said to haunt the summit and mountain passes of Ben Macdui, the highest peak in the Cairngorms and the second highest peak in the whole of the British Isles. Obviously, down to his incredibly remote residence, few encounters with the Grey Man have occurred in folklore, but those who witnessed him described it as an impossibly tall figure, covered head to toe in short hair, surrounded by a strange, uneasy fog. As word of the Grey Man passed throughout the Highlands, remarks about hearing a strange, otherworldly howl began to find their way into folklore, and it is often thought that the Grey Man was a part of a grouping of grey people. In fact, as you may have managed to piece together, culturally, the Grey Man of Ben Macdui has been the strongest correlation to the Native American folklore of the Sasquatch, all the way at the top of a mountain in Scotland. Who knew? The thing is though, although the ancient lore of the Highlands told tales about the strange giant folk that lived at the top of the peaks of the Cairngorms, this particular folktale still regularly emerges in recent times. In fact, dozens of contemporary figures have cited the Grey Man, with notable encounters beginning in 1891 and the most recent being back in 1958. You see, many climbers across the Cairngorms regularly warn of running into the Grey Man to this day, and the legend of the Philiath seemingly still lives on. Next up at number 2, Koshai The Immortal. And this guy is equal parts horrifying and equal parts comically awesome. And in fact, Koshai The Immortal, also known as Koshai the Deathless, is one of the most prolific figures in Russian and Slavic folklore, often filling the role of the big bad archetypal male antagonist to many of their mythologies and cautionary tales. Koshai The Immortal serves as the masculine counterpart to the terrifying Baba Yaga, the woods witch that roams the wild in her hut built upon the legs of a giant chicken. Isn't folklore awesome? Although Koshai is a malevolent, formless entity, he often appears as a gaunt, bony, grizzled old wizard with a long grey beard clutching a sharp, serpentine dagger. In many folk tales, Koshai was depicted as riding naked throughout the wild on the back of a giant white stallion, searching for young women to kidnap and take back to his evil citadel in the dark parts of the wilderness. The thing is though, although his origins are relatively unknown, the most common proponent of Koshai's lore is the spell that he cast upon himself to make himself immortal. As the legend goes, Koshai the Immortal has buried his soul inside a series of nested objects that he has hidden far away on a remote island. On the island stands a tall oak tree, and at the bottom of the oak tree is a large oak chest. Buried inside the chest is a large hare, and within the hare is the corpse of a duck, and within the duck is an egg, and hidden within the egg is a tiny needle that contains Koshai's soul. Throughout Slavic legend, no one even came close to figuring out where his soul was hidden, and because of that he was free to continue his malevolent reign for all eternity. Also, a little side note, but in one of the greatest video games ever created, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, an evil frost mage named Koshai is the main villain. So there you go, another reason to play The Witcher. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Curie. And this one is incredibly interesting because this particular folk legend comes from a very interesting part of England, Devon, an ancient place steeped in its own unique folklore and mystery, and perhaps its most horrifying folklore monster is the Curie. As the legend goes, out on the vast and bleak moors of Dartmoor, many people throughout the ages were lured away by the mythical will o' the wisps, bright lights that transfix travellers and turn them to stray off the path where they would ultimately meet their deaths. By those ancient graves, a strange dark demonic creature known as a Curie would manifest, where it would wait for passers-by and then latch on to their necks. Once the Curie had you over the course of several weeks, it would slowly convince you that it was real by whispering violent and evil thoughts into your ear. Sometimes you would dream of its existence, and as you dreamt, you'd feel a cold touch on the back of your neck. Gradually over time, its presence would start to become more and more apparent, and at night it would grab your leg, it would attack you in your dreams, It would change the face of your family members when you were talking to them into a dark, twisted vision of itself. The Kuri is a creation of pure evil, and it would never make itself known to anyone else, forcing you to question your own sanity. And that's when the Kuri had you. As you pled to be let go, it would start bargaining with you, and it will promise you that if you return to the graves on the moors, you'll be free from its evil grasp and the torment will be over. Well, of course, once you did that, the Kuri would tell you that the grave is just a few steps further, but eventually, of course, you'd never reach your destination, and eventually your body would succumb to exhaustion out on the moors as the Kuri kept you alive long enough to watch your body deteriorate in the elements, where a new grave would form for the next victim. Yeah, if you're ever in Devon, guys, steer clear of the moors at night. It's a nice place though.